Before I begin, I should warn you that this is a video discussing the 1975 Moorgate tube crash, and as such contains material that some viewers may find disturbing. The morning of the 28th of February, 1975, started out much like any other at Moorgate tube station. Platforms 9 and 10 saw the usual rush hour traffic. These platforms, along with the rest of the Highbury branch of the Northern Line, were to be handed over to British Rail later that year, but until then it was business as usual. The 8:38 train was due in. It had left Drayton Park 30 seconds late. It was under the care of Leslie Newson, a solid, conscientious driver. Railman Andrews was on duty on Platform 9. As the train approached, Andrews realised something was very wrong. The train was coming in fast, too fast. Before Andrews could give a warning, the train ploughed through the buffer stop at over 30 miles per hour, through the sand drag and crashed into the end wall. The first carriage was bent in two by the impact. The second buried itself underneath the first. The third rode over the other two. Emergency services were quick to respond, with ambulances arriving 8 minutes after the crash. Any rail crash will be a complex rescue operation, but underground it's worse. Dark, dirty and confined, heavy lifting equipment can't be brought in, and the heat soon becomes intolerable with the lack of air circulation. So it was at Moorgate. Journalist Gerard Kemp of the Daily Telegraph, an eyewitness to the rescue operation, described the scene as a horrible mess of limbs and mangled iron. It took nearly 13.5 hours to remove the last of the survivors from the wreckage, and the last body, that of driver Newson, was finally hauled out 4 days later. The final death toll was 43, plus 74 injured. The accident was compounded by the unique nature of the line into Moorgate. This was part of the Northern City Line, built to take full-size mainline trains. It had been taken over by London Transport in 1933, who operated it as a branch of the Northern Line, using standard Northern Line trains. These were 1938 deep-level stock, considerably smaller than mainline trains, and so there was space for a pile-up to form in the roof of the tunnel. The majority of the passengers were in the front coaches, which were the closest to the station exit. The question arising in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, which has been asked many times over the following decades, is, why did this happen? The train itself was in perfect mechanical condition, as were the signals. Failure of either was ruled out. The eventual conclusion reached following the inquest was driver error. But this is, at best, a partial explanation. Guard Fryer, also on duty at Moorgate, reported that Newson appeared to be looking straight ahead as the train came in, with his hands on the controls. He did not appear alarmed, he didn't attempt to shield his face. Other witnesses at the time corroborated this. Post-mortem X-rays concluded that he did indeed have his hands on the controls, including the dead man's handle. The dead man's handle, as the name implies, is an emergency system. If pressure is taken off the handle, the train automatically applies its brakes. Newson did not take his hand off the handle. There was no evidence of heart attack, stroke or seizure, although the decomposition of the body caused by spending 4 days in the hot tunnel meant that there was some room for ambiguity there. There were no burns on Newson's skin indicating electrocution. An elevated blood alcohol level was found at post-mortem, but again, this may have been the effects of decomposition. Newson was not known to be a heavy drinker, and none of his colleagues reported anything amiss about his behaviour on the morning of the accident. Writer Lawrence Marks, whose father was killed in the crash, believes the answer is suicide. In a Daily Mail article from 2010, he sets out the evidence. He points out an account by Bob Harris, the guard who regularly worked with Newson, stating that the normally careful driver had overrun the platform the previous week. He also states that in an interview he held with Newson's widow, there was a bottle of white rum in the drinks cabinet, something that would have left no scent of drink on Newson's breath. Was it possible, Marks asks, that the normally light drinker Newson took a drink to build up his courage? Marks concludes that, having eliminated all possible medical and mechanical causes, Newson must have deliberately crashed the train. There are a lot of flaws with this theory. I'll start with the Dutch courage theory advanced by Marks. Newson had been on duty since 6:10 that morning, and none of his colleagues reported seeing him take a drink. Nor did they report anything unusual about his behaviour. He had a flask with him containing milk which he had shared with a colleague at the start of his shift. No other containers were found in the cab or among Newson's personal effects. In other words, if he took a drink, it must have been over 2 hours before the crash, by which time the effects should have worn off. The bottle of rum in itself proves nothing. Marks states that Mrs. Newson said that the level in the bottle might have gone down. Might have. One might also point out that Newson had been driving the train for 2 hours without incident up until the crash. Why wait so long? Marks claims that Newson was a lonely man with no friends, hence his motivation for suicide. This doesn't line up with other accounts. He had a wife and 2 daughters and had a friendly relationship with his colleagues. Now, one cannot know exactly what is going on in a person's head, and it is common for a person's depression to go entirely unnoticed. But I'm going with what Marks specifically said, which does not appear to line up with the facts. That by all accounts, Newson was not a troubled man. If he did harbour suicidal thoughts, why end it in the form of a train crash, taking so many others with him? Most damning is the question of the money. Newson had withdrawn £300 from the Building Society in order to buy his daughter a car, which he planned to do after his shift. Indeed, he had the money with him at the time of the crash. Even Marks cannot account for this in his theory of a premeditated suicide. What is particularly interesting is a comment on the article by someone claiming to be Eddie Carrera, the officer in charge of the rescue. He states that neither he nor any of the other police or London transport staff dealing with the accident agreed with the suicide theory. I'm inclined to agree. While I sympathise with Mark's loss, I feel that his conclusion is driven more by the need for closure over the death of his father than by the facts. So yet again I have to ask, why did this happen? Human error is a possibility, though the word that keeps cropping up when discussing Newson is conscientious. Some have theorised that he was distracted or daydreaming on entering the station, but others argue that the jolt as the train went over points and entered the light of the station should have brought him back to reality. Carrera argues that the speed of the train would have made stopping impossible even if this was the case. We cannot discount the possibility of some neurological issue. As mentioned earlier, Newson's body had been in the tunnel for 4 days when it was removed from the cab and taken for post-mortem. Decomposition had reached the stage where full analysis of the brain was impossible, so a neurological cause cannot be entirely ruled out. So what conclusion can we reach? Well, I'm not a doctor or an engineer. I'm just some guy on the internet looking at the facts 4.5 decades later. I personally lean towards the neurological explanation, but the sad reality is we'll never know the real reason why 43 people died at Moorgate that day. Following the disaster, the handover to British Rail proceeded as planned, and the line remains in operation as part of the National Rail network. In 2013 and 2014, memorials were unveiled, one at Finsbury Square and one on the south side of the station. The Moorgate crash was the worst peacetime disaster in the history of the Underground. However, in the following years, a new automated system was introduced at terminal stations, known as Moorgate Control. This is a set of sensors on the station approach. If the train passes at more than 12.5 miles per hour, the sensors automatically trigger the emergency brake. Since the crash, several lines have gone over to automatic train operation, with others planned to follow, which at least eliminates the possibility of driver error. While the accident at Moorgate was horrific, at least lessons have been learned for the future. Thank you for watching this episode of Tales from the Tube. I hope you found it interesting. If so, then please hit the like button and consider subscribing, and I'll see you again next time.